The View studio hummed with its familiar Tuesday morning energy. Cameras swept across the packed audience as crew members made final adjustments, their movements sharp and purposeful under the hot studio lights. Today carried a special electricity. Matthew McConaughey was in the building. He stepped onto the set wearing his trademark easy smile, a perfectly tailored but casual navy blazer over dark jeans, his sandy hair tousled just enough to look effortless. The audience erupted. Women in the front row whistled. A man shouted, "All right, all right, all right!" McConaughey chuckled, offering his characteristic finger gun gesture that sent another wave of applause through the room. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ladies and gentlemen, Matthew McConaughey, Sunny Hostin announced warmly as she rose to greet him with genuine enthusiasm. Joy Behar clapped with theatrical flair, Anna Navarro beamed, and even the usually composed Whoopi Goldberg managed a smile, though her eyes held something sharper, more calculated. McConaughey made his rounds, shaking hands and offering that Texas charm that had carried him from romantic comedies to Oscar gold. "Good morning, y'all," he drawled as he settled into the guest chair with fluid grace. "Thanks for having me back." "Matthew," Sunny began, her voice bright, "congratulations on the documentary. It's such a beautiful exploration of human connection." "Thank you, Sunny. That means a lot." His eyes lit up as he spoke about the project. "You know, we followed ordinary folks doing extraordinary things for each other. No cameras, no scripts, just people being people. It reminded me that kindness isn't rare. We just don't talk about it enough." The audience murmured approvingly. But Whoopi leaned forward slightly, her pen tapping against her notepad. Her introduction carried a subtle edge. "And this follows your memoir, right? Another deep dive into the McConaughey philosophy?" Something flickered in Matthew's eyes, not alarm, but awareness. "Well, I wouldn't call it philosophy, just observations from the road." Whoopi's smile remained fixed, but her tone shifted. "Speaking of the road, Matthew, you've built quite the brand around this optimism of yours. Unity, hope, finding common ground. But in today's America," she paused, letting the weight settle, "isn't that kind of thinking a little naive?" The audience quieted. McConaughey's posture remained relaxed, but his fingers drummed once against his knee. "I don't think hope is naive, Whoopi. I think it's necessary. Maybe the most necessary thing we've got." "Necessary for who, though?" Whoopi pressed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You talk about unity, bringing people together, but unity with who? Are there lines you won't cross? People you won't unite with?" A subtle tension rippled through the studio. Camera operators glanced at each other. McConaughey leaned back, his smile still in place, but more deliberate now. "Well, I believe in building bridges, not walls. That doesn't mean you don't have standards. It means you lead with understanding before judgment." Joy Behar sensed the shift and jumped in with a nervous laugh. "Speaking of Texas, Matthew, I bet you know where to get the best barbecue in Austin, right? I'm always looking for good restaurant recommendations." The joke landed flat. A few scattered chuckles from the audience couldn't mask the awkward timing. McConaughey offered a polite smile, but his attention remained fixed on Whoopi. "Joy, I do know a place or two, but Whoopi asked a serious question, and I think it deserves a serious answer." He turned back to Whoopi, his voice calm but firmer. "Look, understanding someone doesn't mean agreeing with them. It means being brave enough to listen, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." Whoopi added slowly, but her expression suggested she wasn't buying it. That sounds wonderful in theory, Matthew, but what about in practice?" Whoopi's voice dropped slightly, taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Because I've been watching some of your past interviews, and you have this habit of talking about understanding both sides when it comes to divisive issues. Some people might call that diplomatic. Others might say you're just avoiding taking a real stand." On cue, clips began playing on the studio monitors, snippets from McConaughey's recent interviews where he'd spoken about political polarization, about finding middle ground, about listening across party lines. His own voice echoed through the studio. I think we've got to get back to respecting each other as Americans first. The clips ended, and silence stretched uncomfortably. McConaughey's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whoopi, I stand by every word in those clips. Optimism isn't the same as avoidance. Sometimes the hardest stand to take is the one that says we can do better. Audience murmurs rippled, some supportive, others uncertain. A woman near the front crossed her arms while another nodded approvingly. Sunny Hostin leaned forward, her voice carefully diplomatic. Matthew, can you expand on that? What does doing better look like to you? Before he could answer fully, Whoopi interjected. But see, that's exactly what I'm talking about. We can do better. That's the kind of vague, feel-good language that doesn't actually say anything. Some people would say that's just code for dodging accountability. McConaughey's smile faltered for the first time. He leaned forward, his hands clasping together, and when he spoke, his voice carried a new edge. With respect, Whoopi, I don't think there's anything vague about treating people with dignity. I don't think there's anything feel-good about standing up for what's right, even when, especially when, it's not popular. The temperature in the room had shifted. Camera operators held their positions, but you could see the tension in their shoulders. Even the audience seemed to sense they were witnessing something more than typical morning TV banter. Whoopi's pen tapped faster against her notepad. She wasn't backing down. The studio air felt thick now, charged with an electricity that made everyone hyper-aware of every word, every glance. Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her chair, studying McConaughey like a chess player, contemplating her next move. When she spoke, her voice carried a cutting edge that sliced through any pretense of morning show pleasantries. You know what, Matthew? That smile works great on camera. That folksy charm, the Texas drawl, it's all very appealing. But does it work when you actually have to take a real stand? When you can't just smile your way out of giving people the hard truth they need to hear? A collective intake of breath swept through the audience. Someone in the third row audibly gasped. McConaughey's jaw tightened, and for the first time since sitting down, his composed facade showed genuine cracks. His hands, which had been casually draped over the chair arms, now gripped them slightly. Whoopi, he said, his voice lower, more deliberate. You're suggesting my values are some kind of performance. That's not just wrong, it's insulting. He paused, his eyes distant for a moment, then refocused with startling intensity. My father taught me that a man's character isn't measured by how loud he talks or how angry he gets. It's measured by whether he still treats people with respect when they don't deserve it. That's not charm, that's principle. The audience was dead silent now, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond typical morning TV drama. Joy Behar, desperately trying to lighten the moment, forced a laugh. Well, you don't want to mess with a Texas man's daddy, right, folks? A few strained chuckles rippled through the crowd, but they died quickly. McConaughey didn't even glance in Joy's direction. His focus remained locked on Whoopi, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of genuine hurt. I came here to talk about stories of human decency. Instead, you're questioning whether decency itself is real. McConaughey straightened in his chair, attempting to regain control of the conversation. His media training kicked in. Pivot, redirect, get back to the message. You know what? Let me tell you about something we captured in the documentary. There's this moment where a stranger... That's nice, but what I want to know is what happens when the people you're trying to unite with don't share your values, when they actively work against everything you claim to stand for. The interruption hung in the air like a slap. McConaughey stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still partially open. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some turning to look at their neighbors with raised eyebrows, others shaking their heads. I was telling you about... I heard what you were telling me. More stories about kindness and hope. But I'm asking you about reality, Matthew, about what happens when hope meets hate. His famous composure was visibly fraying now. McConaughey spoke more slowly, each word deliberate and measured, like he was trying to maintain control through sheer force of will. If you'd let me finish, you'd hear that the story I'm trying to tell you is about reality, about what happens when people choose connection over division. Ana Navarro leaned forward, sensing an opening. I think what Matthew is saying— Ana, please, Whoopi said without looking at her, her hand raised dismissively. Let Matthew speak for himself, if he can. The condescension in those last 3 words, if he can, hit like a physical blow. You could see it register in McConaughey's face, the way his eyes flashed with something darker than mere irritation. The rhythm of the conversation had become jagged, broken. Every time McConaughey tried to build momentum, to tell his story, to explain his position, Whoopi derailed him. The audience was no longer just watching. They were witnessing something uncomfortable, something that felt too raw for morning TV. The pretense of a friendly interview had completely evaporated. What remained was something more primal, a clash of worldviews played out under hot studio lights with millions watching. McConaughey leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and his voice dropped to something more intense than the audience had ever heard from him.
You want to know what I stand for? I stand for believing that hope isn't a costume you put on when it's convenient. It's a choice you make every single day, especially when everything around you says you're a fool for making it. His words carried genuine passion now, stripped of any performance or polish. I choose to believe we can do better because the alternative, your alternative, is that we just give up on each other, and I won't do that. Whoopi's response came like a counterpunch. And some choices are just easier when you're rich and famous, aren't they? When you can afford to be optimistic because you're insulated from the real consequences of other people's hatred. The words struck home. McConaughey's face flushed, and for the first time since sitting down, he raised his voice. You think money makes it easier to have faith in people? You think fame protects you from disappointment, from betrayal, from watching people you care about tear each other apart? Ana Navarro tried again to interject, her voice urgent. I think what we're seeing here is exactly why Matthew's message matters. Ana, I've got this, Whoopi snapped. But Ana continued. Because we can disagree without demonizing each other. Matthew's trying to build bridges, and we're what? Whoopi's voice rose. We're holding him accountable? We're asking the hard questions that his adoring fans won't ask? The studio felt like it might explode. Crew members exchanged worried glances. Even Joy Behar, usually ready with a quip to break tension, sat in stunned silence. McConaughey's hands were trembling slightly now, not with fear, but with the effort of containing something much larger than anger. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than if he'd shouted. I see what's happening here, Whoopi. You've decided who I am, and nothing I say is going to change that. So what are we really doing? A moment of profound silence settled over the studio. The audience held its collective breath. Camera operators froze. Even the crew members backstage seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted. McConaughey sat perfectly still, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the cameras. When he finally spoke, the charm was gone. The careful media training, the practiced deflection, the Texas drawl, all of it stripped away. What remained was raw honesty. You invited me here to talk about my work. You said this was about the documentary, about the book, about stories of human connection. Instead, you've put me on trial for the crime of believing in people. An audible gasp rose from the audience. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." The studio lights seemed brighter somehow, more unforgiving. Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, but McConaughey held up his hand, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of someone who had made a decision. No, he said firmly, speaking over her attempt to interrupt. I've listened to you tear apart everything I stand for. I've watched you twist my words and question my motives. I've sat here while you've suggested that decency is some kind of privilege that only the wealthy can afford. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. But I won't sit here and let you tell me that choosing hope over cynicism makes me a fraud. The other hosts looked like deer in headlights. Sunny's face showed genuine concern. Joy's mouth hung slightly open. Anna gripped her note cards so tightly they were bending. McConaughey's hands were trembling slightly now, not with fear, but with the effort of containing something much larger than anger. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than if he'd shouted. "I see what's happening here, Whoopi. You've decided who I am, and nothing I say is going to change that. So what are we really doing?" A moment of profound silence settled over the studio. The audience held its collective breath. Camera operators froze. Even the crew members backstage seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted. McConaughey sat perfectly still, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the cameras. When he finally spoke, the charm was gone. The careful media training, the practiced deflection, the Texas drawl, all of it stripped away. What remained was raw honesty. "You invited me here to talk about my work. You said this was about the documentary, about the book, about stories of human connection. Instead, you've put me on trial for the crime of believing in people." An audible gasp rose from the audience. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." The studio lights seemed brighter somehow, more unforgiving. Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, but McConaughey held up his hand, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of someone who had made a decision. "No," he said firmly, speaking over her attempt to interrupt. "I've listened to you tear apart everything I stand for. I've watched you twist my words and question my motives. I've sat here while you've suggested that decency is some kind of privilege that only the wealthy can afford." His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "But I won't sit here and let you tell me that choosing hope over cynicism makes me a fraud." The other hosts looked like deer in headlights. Sunny's face showed genuine concern. Joy's mouth hung slightly open. Anna gripped her note cards so tightly they were bending. McConaughey's hands trembling slightly now, not with fear, but with the effort of containing something much larger than anger. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than if he'd shouted. He spent the entire career trying to tell stories that matter, trying to find the good in complicated situations. And you know what? I'm not going to apologize for that anymore. The finality in his tone sent a chill through the room. This wasn't just an actor having a moment. This was someone reaching the absolute limit of what they would tolerate. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. McConaughey reached for his water glass with steady hands, took a slow sip, and set it down with precise care of someone buying time to make an irreversible choice. His eyes swept across the set, first to Sunny, whose expression pleaded with him not to do what everyone sensed was coming, then to the audience, many of whom were leaning forward in their seats, already with phones out and recording. "You know what?" His voice was calm now, almost conversational, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he'd been shouting. "I think we're done here." The words landed like a thunderclap. Murmurs erupted from the audience. A camera operator actually took a step back. The floor manager's face went pale as he realized what was happening. McConaughey's hands moved to his lapel mic with practiced efficiency of someone who'd worn thousands of them. The small click as he unclipped it seemed to echo through the suddenly cavernous studio. He held the tiny device for a moment, looking at it as if it represented something larger than just a piece of audio equipment.
"Matthew," Sunny's voice was soft, almost pleading. She half rose from her chair, her hand reaching out slightly. He turned to her with the first genuine smile he'd shown in 10 minutes, sad but resolute. He shook his head gently, and in that gesture was both an apology and an explanation. This wasn't about her. This wasn't about any of them, except Whoopi. "I appreciate you having me," he said, his voice carrying across the studio with perfect clarity, even without the microphone. "But some conversations aren't worth having." The crew stood frozen, unsure of protocol. This wasn't something covered in their training. Walk-offs were the stuff of legend, stories passed down through the industry, but they rarely happened on live television. The director in the booth was frantically gesturing to camera operators, trying to decide whether to follow him or cut away. McConaughey stood slowly, his movements fluid and deliberate. He straightened his blazer with the same care he might use when preparing for a red carpet, as if dignity were something he could wear. The moment had arrived. McConaughey turned toward the audience, and for a brief second, his famous smile returned. Not the media-trained version, but something more authentic. He offered a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement one gives to friends at the end of a good evening, and began walking toward the exit. The audience's reaction was electric and immediate. Applause erupted in scattered bursts, some supportive, some uncertain, some clearly conflicted. A woman in the front row stood and clapped enthusiastically. Others remained seated, mouths agape. The sound was ragged, unsynchronized, reflecting the confusion of a crowd trying to process something unprecedented. "Matthew McConaughey, everyone!" Whoopi's voice cut through the noise, sharp and professional, as she attempted to regain control of her show. She turned to face the camera with practiced composure, but there was something brittle in her expression, a crack in the armor that millions of viewers would replay and analyze for weeks to come. Camera operators scrambled, their training warring with their instincts. Should they follow him, stay on the hosts, cut to commercial? The usually choreographed dance of live television had become chaos. As McConaughey reached the edge of the set, Joy Behar muttered something under her breath that was caught by her still-hot microphone. "Well, that's a first." The comment would become a meme by evening, shared thousands of times with the caption, "When even Joy Behar is speechless." McConaughey paused at the threshold between the set and the backstage area. For a heartbeat, it seemed like he might turn around, might offer some final word or gesture. Instead, he simply raised his hand in a brief wave, not to the cameras, not to the hosts, but to the audience members who were still applauding. Then he was gone, disappearing into the dimly lit backstage area like an actor exiting stage left. The cameras lingered on the empty space where he had been standing, as if expecting him to reappear and reveal this had all been an elaborate performance. But the chair where Matthew McConaughey had sat for what was supposed to be a friendly promotional interview remained empty. His absence more powerful than his presence had been. "We'll be right back after this break," Whoopi announced to the cameras, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying the first hints of uncertainty. The red recording lights dimmed, and the studio erupted into a buzz of whispered conversations and nervous energy that felt like the aftermath of a car accident. Behind the scenes, phones were already lighting up. Producers huddled in urgent conferences. Social media managers watched in real time as clips of the confrontation began spreading across platforms faster than they could track. #McConaughey walkout was trending within minutes, accompanied by split-screen videos of his exit and reaction gifs that would define the cultural conversation for weeks. When they returned from commercial, the remaining hosts attempted to salvage the show with careful professionalism. "Sometimes passionate discussions bring out strong feelings," Sunny offered, diplomatically, her words chosen with the precision of someone who knew millions were watching and dissecting every syllable. Whoopi remained largely silent for the rest of the segment, a telling contrast to her usual dominance of the conversation. When she did speak, her comments were clipped, professional, but those who knew her could detect something rattled underneath the surface. Outside the ABC studios, a small crowd had already gathered. McConaughey emerged from a side exit 20 minutes later, still wearing his navy blazer, but somehow looking lighter, unburdened. A few fans called out his name, and he paused to sign a book and take a selfie with a young woman who told him, "That took guts." "Sometimes you gotta stand up for what you believe in," he replied simply, his famous drawl returning now that the cameras were gone. By evening, news outlets across the spectrum were running with headlines. McConaughey's moral stand, the day optimism fought back, and when enough is enough. The moment had transcended morning television gossip and become something larger, a cultural flashpoint about authenticity, public discourse, and the price of staying true to one's principles. The viral storm was just beginning, but Matthew McConaughey was already driving toward the airport, his integrity intact and his message clearer than ever.
If you liked the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.